The noon sun scorched the dirt-packed ground of Granger's Crossing, a ragged Texas settlement that didn't even have its name painted on the saloon. Dust curled in the air with every bootstep, and the scent of horse sweat and smoke lingered, thick. But today, the townsfolk weren't gathered for market or rodeo. They came for the kind of auction no one talked about afterward. A festerward. Makeshift stage had been thrown together outside the sheriff's office, just a wagon bed lifted on barrels. Men leaned against posts, spit chewing tobacco, and muttered amongst themselves. A few women stood with tight lips and judgment in their eyes. No one laughed. Even the kids were kept home. This wasn't the kind of event a child should see. Sheriff, a barrel-chested man with red suspenders and a black hat, stepped up onto the wagon bed with a rifle slung casually over his shoulder. He cleared his throat. "All right," he barked. "What we got here is a prisoner deemed unfit for jail. Caught trespassing on military ground, wouldn't speak, and killed 2 guards while being transported. No known tribe, no known language ain't. No use to nobody. But if any of y'all got a use for strong labor or need a big body to clear timber, this one'll do." The crowd shifted as 2 deputies dragged the man forward. He was enormous, well over 6 feet and broad through the keel. Shoulders, with arms like tree limbs bound in thick iron shackles. A burlap sack covered his head and had soaked through with sweat and old blood. Dirt and dried blood streaked his trousers. His chest rose and fell in slow, deliberate breaths. A thick leather collar fastened around his neck like he was some kind of beast. The murmurs began. "Damn savages," cursed. "He don't blink. He's been staring through that sack for 10 minutes. I heard he don't eat. Let him die. Shoulda hanged him." The sheriff slapped his hand on the wagon boards. "Starting at $5. Who'll take him?" Silence. Not a single hand rose. Men shifted. A few chuckled nervously. Even the hardened ranchers weren't about to bring this stranger home. $3? Nothing. 1? Still silence died just when the sheriff looked ready to wave the deputies back and call it done. A soft voice cut through the hot stillness. "I'll give $1." She said. Head snapped toward the back of the crowd. Clara McBride stood tall in her patched calico dress and wide-brimmed straw hat, her hands tucked calmly into the pockets of her apron. She was a slender woman in her early 30s, with wheat-colored hair braided into a crown and sun-darkened skin that said she worked harder than any ranch hand. The sheriff squinted. "Come again?" "I said I'll give $1." The silence broke into a low rumble of disbelief. "Clara, what in hell? She lost her mind. She's a widow, ain't got no man. What'd she want with a—" But Clara didn't flinch. She stepped forward, one slow stride at a time. Dust kicked up at her hem. Her gaze never left the man in chains. The sheriff blinked. "Lady, he ain't fit for servitude. He don't talk. He's dangerous. We were fixing to hang him if no one—" "I'm not buying a servant," Clara interrupted, her voice steady. "I'm offering him a place." A beat of stunned silence followed. Even the prisoner's chest rose sharply. The sheriff scratched his beard. "Ma'am, he ain't Christian. He ain't tame. You're risking your life." "I already buried a husband," Clara said. "And I'm not scared of a man who hasn't said a word." The deputies exchanged a glance. One shrugged. "$1's $1," said the sheriff. "He's yours." They shoved the Comanche forward, and Clara didn't step back. When the chain was placed in her hand, it felt warm from his skin. She looked up at the sack and the ragged edges where it had been torn. She didn't reach for it. Not yet. The crowd slowly dispersed, shaking their heads and whispering under their breath. The sheriff muttered something to his deputies and wandered back into his office. Done with it all, Clara turned and walked home, leading the chained giant silently behind her. And though he didn't speak, didn't flinch, didn't resist, the entire town knew something had shifted in that dusty street. Whatever Clara McBride had just done, it wasn't about pity. It wasn't about foolishness. It was something else entirely, something that would change everything. The walk back to Clara's homestead was long and dry, with nothing but cicada wine and dust devils to keep her company. The Comanche giant trudged behind her, the length of chain dragging softly between them. She never looked back. Not because she wasn't afraid, but because she'd already made her choice. Her farm sat nearly 2 miles from town, tucked into a gully where the creek had dried up 3 summers ago. Her husband, Isaac, had built the small house with his bare hands before the fever took him. Since then, she'd kept it going with stubborn grit, barter deals, and sheer will. The house needed a new roof, the barn leaned east like a drunkard, and the mule old Sally wasn't long for this world. But Clara had survived worse than dry land and talkative neighbors. When they arrived at the edge of her property, she finally turned to the man. "I won't lock you up," she said. "Not unless you give me reason." The man said nothing. He stood motionless, the sack still over his face, his shoulders broad and bruised. Even slumped, he towered over her by nearly 1.5 feet. She could feel the heat of his breath from where she stood. She pointed to the barn. "You'll sleep in there tonight. There's water in the trough and old feed you can eat if you're hungry. Tomorrow I'll see about that chain." He didn't move. Clara hesitated. Then, slowly, she stepped toward him. Her hands, still dusty from the walk, reached up to touch the rope that secured the burlap sack. His chest rose sharply. She paused. "I won't pull it off unless you let me," she said quietly. "But I want to see who I brought into my home." A long moment passed. He didn't speak, but she saw the smallest tilt of his head, barely a nod. With one slow pull, she untied the knot and peeled the sack away. The face beneath it was both terrifying and tragic. His skin was wine-burned and cracked. A long scar ran from his left brow to his cheekbone, bisecting an old wound. His jaw was strong, shadowed in dark stubble, and his eyes dark as coal pierced through her like twin knives. He didn't look at the ground or around the land. He looked at her. Not like an animal, not like prey, but like someone measuring, assessing, waiting. Clara didn't flinch. "All right," she said softly. "Barn's that way." She turned and walked toward the house. After a moment, she heard the soft crunch of boots behind her. That night, the wind picked up. The shingles on the roof rattled, and the porch creaked like it always did in storms. Clara lit a lantern, made herself a thin stew from beans and dried onion, and watched the barn through the window. No movement. She couldn't sleep. Part of her wondered what she'd done. Why she had stepped forward in that square. Why she'd spent her last dollar on a man who might slit her throat in the night. But then she remembered the way his body didn't tense when she touched the sack. The way his hands, scarred and bruised, remained at his sides. She didn't see a savage. She saw someone no one had treated like a man. Just before midnight, she heard a low sound. A growl? A howl? No. Dogs. Wild ones. Then a crash. She grabbed her rifle from the corner and bolted to the porch, just in time to see the barn doors swing open. Shapes darted out into the night, 4 or 5 of them snarling, snapping dogs that had been digging through her storage for months, and behind them, racing. Out barefoot into the dark was the Comanche. No chain. No sack. Just him, his arms swinging like hammers as he chased them off into the dark. The dogs scattered. He didn't return for 10 minutes. When he did, he stood at the edge of the barn, blood on his forearm and one torn piece of a dog's pelt clinging to his belt. He looked up at her. Said nothing. Then disappeared into the barn. Clara lowered the rifle. For the first time in months, she felt protected. She didn't know his name. She didn't know what he'd done. But she knew one thing. Whatever. He wasn't empty, and she wasn't alone. The next morning, Clara woke to the scent of rain-soaked earth. It hadn't actually rained, just a trickle of moisture in the air, enough to dampen the dust and make the boards on the porch swell. She wrapped her shawl around her shoulders and stepped outside with her coffee, steam curling up from the tin mug like smoke from a prayer. The barn doors were wide open. At first, her stomach dropped. Her eyes scanned the yard for signs, hoof prints, broken fence rails, even blood, but nothing was disturbed. Then, from the side of the house, she heard something she didn't expect. Kalon hammering. She followed the sound around to the lean-to, where her woodpile sat crooked and half-rotted. There, shirtless and focused, was the Comanche man. His skin glistened with sweat, dark against the rising sun. He was building a brace for the support beam that had cracked 2 winters ago. It was the kind of job Clara had been dreading for months, heavy lifting, precise work. And no one in town willing to help without charging a price she couldn't afford. He didn't look up. She watched in silence, taking in the fluid, practiced motion of his arms. His hands, though swollen and cut, moved like a man who had built many things before. Not a savage, not a brute. A craftsman. You don't have to do that, she said softly. He paused, hammer held midair. Then, without turning, he said his first word since the fire. Rot. It wasn't an answer. It was a fact. A declaration. Then he kept hammering. Clara blinked, surprised more by the sound of his voice than the work itself. It was low, gravelly like thunder rolling across distant hills, but steady, measured, and somehow calm. She took a cautious step forward. You speak English? He gave a short nod. One tap, then another. What's your name? No answer. I call you Hawk, she said, stepping closer. Because of the tattoo on your arm. The talon there looks like it's holding something. He looked down, just for a second, at the old ink that had faded into the muscle of his upper arm. His eyes stayed distant, as if recalling something long buried. Not tattoo, he murmured. Brand. Clara's brow furrowed. What kind of man gets branded? He stopped hammering. Then, slowly, he looked over at her, not defiant, not angry, just tired. The kind that chose the wrong side. That was all he said before returning to work. Later that day, Clara made lunch-hard biscuits, boiled beans, and a sliver of cured pork she'd been saving. She brought a plate to the barn, where Hawk sat on a hay bale wrapping a torn strip of cloth around his palm. I've got food, she offered. He took the plate, nodding once, but didn't eat. Clara sat on a barrel opposite him, watching quietly. You didn't sleep last night. I listened. To what? Coyotes. Wind? Boots. Boots? She asked sharply. He glanced up. Someone came close, changed their mind. Clara gripped her mug tighter. She hadn't heard a thing. The thought that someone had been prowling outside while she slept sent a chill down her spine. Why didn't you wake me? You needed sleep, he replied simply. She stared at him. You think I'm not scared of you? His gaze didn't waver. You should be, but I'm not. Then you're not wise. His bluntness didn't sting. In fact, it comforted her. Clara had grown tired of men who smoothed their lies with charm. This man didn't lie. He didn't need to. She stood. You don't owe me anything, you know? I know. I didn't buy you to own you. I know that too. He finally picked up a biscuit and took a bite. Clara lingered in the doorway for a moment longer, then left him to eat. That night, as the wind howled outside and the shutters banged loosely against the windows, Clara lay in her bed, staring at the ceiling. It was strange how safe she felt knowing a man once considered dangerous enough to hang was sleeping just 20 yards from her door. Stranger still was how right it felt. She hadn't heard him coming, hadn't seen the look in his eyes when she bid at the auction. But something deep in her chest, something she hadn't trusted in years, told her he was here for a reason. Not by chance, not by pity, but by fate. By the end of the week, Clara had already learned two things about Hawk. First, he worked like a man who didn't know how to stop. The lean-to was reinforced, the garden cleared of weeds, and the back fence, snapped by a fallen branch last winter, was upright and braced by hand-hewn stakes. All of it done in silence, with his hands cracked and bleeding but never trembling. Second, people in town had noticed Dot had started with the stairs. When Clara rode in to buy flour and lamp oil, Mrs. Yates at the general store whispered to her husband and wouldn't meet Clara's eye. Reverend Park didn't tip his hat. And outside the blacksmith's, young Eli Mercer spat in the dirt just as she passed by. Clara ignored it, but the tension hung heavier than storm clouds. When she stepped out of the mercantile, Sheriff Merton was waiting. He leaned against the hitching post, hat low, chewing on a toothpick with the casual posture of a man pretending he wasn't waiting at all. "Mornin', Clara." She nodded. "Sheriff, you hear about what happened to the Wilkins farm last night?" "No." "Someone stole 2 horses. Left the corral gate open." Clara raised an eyebrow. "You think I had something to do with that?" "Not you," he said evenly. "But folks are nervous. A lot of men saw you walk off with that prisoner last week. Now there's an unfamiliar face out near your land. Strong fella, fast, dangerous. He's been working my fences, not robbing stables." The sheriff shrugged. "Don't matter what you believe. Matters what the town believes." Clara crossed her arms. "You came to warn me or threaten me?" "Neither. I came to tell you the law is still the law, and that if anything else goes missing, it won't just be talk this time." He straightened and adjusted his belt. "You brought a storm to your door, Clara. Don't act surprised when lightning strikes." She watched him walk away, a slow dread settling in her bones. When Clara returned home that afternoon, Hawk was skinning a rabbit by the well. He glanced up, saw her face, and stood without a word. "They think you stole horses," she said. He didn't respond. "The sheriff says if anything else goes wrong, they'll come here." "Let them," Hawk muttered. Clara shook her head. "You don't understand. These people don't need proof. You're not one of them. I barely am. They'll ride out in the night and string you up just to feel safe." "Then I'll leave," he said flatly. She stepped forward, her voice sharp. "You do that, and they'll track you through the hills and kill you for running." "I don't fear death." Clara stared at him. "Well, I do." Silence fell between them. A hawk circled overhead, a dark blur against the burning sun. Lowered her voice. "If you go, you die. If you stay, they'll come. So you might as well stay. And I'll keep feeding you, and you'll keep fixing what's broken. And when they show up with torches, I'll stand in front of the door." His eyes locked on hers. Something softened just barely in his expression. Why? She didn't know the answer herself. Maybe it was because she'd already buried one man and wasn't ready to lose another. Maybe it was because she saw a fight in him that hadn't gone out. Or maybe, just maybe, because no one had ever protected her like he had, quietly, fiercely, without a single condition. "I don't like being told who to fear," she said. That evening, as the wind settled and the sky bruised into twilight, a man rode up to Clara's property. It was Samuel Riggs, the son of Judge Riggs, and the same man who once proposed to Clara 6 months after Isaac died. She'd turned him down politely, but he hadn't taken it well. He dismounted without a word and strode right up to her porch, hat in hand. "I heard you've got something living out here that doesn't belong." Clara stood in the doorway, rifle in hand but not raised. "If you're looking for someone to insult, Samuel, you'll have to find someone else," he sneered. "You think you're better than the rest of us? Living out here with a wild animal? Folks say he sleeps in your barn, that you're feeding him like a husband." "I feed him like a human being." Samuel stepped closer. "You want to bring shame on yourself, that's your burden. But if he comes near my land, I'll put him down like a dog." A sudden sound fast, sharp ripped through the air. Hawk was there, between them, so fast Clara didn't see him move. His hand was wrapped around Samuel's collar, lifting the man clear off the ground with terrifying ease. "Say it again," Hawk growled, low and deadly. Samuel choked, face turning red. "Put me down." Clara stepped forward quickly. "Hawk, don't, please." For a moment, it looked like he might ignore her. Then, without a word, Hawk dropped Samuel in the dirt. Samuel scrambled to his feet and staggered to his horse, panting with fury and humiliation. "You'll regret this," he spat, but Clara didn't. "Watch him leave." She was watching Hawk. And for the first time, she saw something new in his eyes. Not rage. Not pain, but loyalty. Clara woke up to silence. Not the usual kind, the early morning hush filled with the buzz of insects and the whisper of prairie wind, but a complete, eerie quiet. No birds. No creak from the barn. No footsteps outside. She pulled on her boots and grabbed her rifle. Out the window, the sun had barely touched the horizon. A faint trail of dust lingered in the air, and her mule brayed low from the pen. Hawk was gone. Her heart jumped into her throat. After everything, the work, the fire, the fence, the way he'd stood between her and Samuel Riggs, he was just gone? She threw open the front door and stepped into the cool dirt yard, scanning every corner of her little farm. That's when she saw it. Not Hawk, but the table. He had built it. A new wooden table now stood on her porch, sanded smooth, pegged together without a single nail, every edge rounded with care. Next to it sat a small wooden bench, just wide enough for two, and resting on the bench, fresh meat, rabbit still warm, and a folded piece of canvas with something inside. She opened it slowly. Inside was her kitchen knife, sharpened to a fine edge, and her old sewing needle, polished and cleaned. He hadn't left her. He was preparing. Later that day, as she hauled a bucket of water from the well, she saw him, walking down from the ridge, shirtless, covered in dust, with a bundle of firewood over one shoulder and his bow slung over the other. His gait was calm but deliberate, like a man who belonged to the land around him. Clara let out the breath she hadn't realized she'd been holding. When he reached the yard, she raised an eyebrow. "You leave before dawn and come back after lunch." "Where have you been?" He dropped the wood near the stack. "Scouting." She blinked. His second sentence. "For what?" "Tracks. Boot prints. Movement. I saw smoke last night. North Ridge." Clara frowned. "Someone out there?" He nodded. "Maybe two, watching." "Watching us? Or the land?" She felt a chill. "You think they're from town?" "No, not yet." That "not yet" sat in her bones like lead. That evening, as they sat outside in the golden wash of sundown, Hawk finally broke the silence between them in a way Clara hadn't expected. "You're not afraid of me?" It wasn't a question. She looked over at him. "No." "Why?" Clara shrugged. "Maybe I should be." He studied her, his dark eyes unreadable. "Men in your town. They fear what they don't understand, hate what doesn't bow. You've met men like them before." He nodded once. She hesitated, then asked gently, "You were a scout, weren't you? For the army?" He didn't answer right away. "I was." "Long ago," Clara let that settle. "They turned on you. They used me, then discarded me." He turned his gaze toward the dying sun. "My people called me traitor. The white men called me savage, so I stopped speaking. Let them decide." What I was, Clara said nothing. There were no words that could soften the truth of that. But she reached out, slowly, and set her hand beside his on the table he'd built. He didn't pull away. That night, Clara woke to coughing. Her own lungs felt thick. The air was warm, too warm. She sat up fast and smelled it. Smoke. She grabbed her. rifle and ran to the window. The barn was on fire. She didn't think, just ran barefoot across the yard toward the flames. Inside were the mule, 3 hens, and Hawk's bedding. The fire licked the roof like a red demon, and the night exploded in heat and sparks. Hawk! She shouted. He was already there, not running to the barn, but into it. She screamed, "No, you'll be trapped." But he vanished into the fire. Seconds passed. The roof groaned. Wood split. She raised her arm to shield herself from the heat. Then he burst back out, leading the mule by the reins, a blanket thrown over its head. 2 chickens squawked under his arm. He staggered toward her, his arm bleeding from a fresh cut. Smoke blackening his chest and arms. Clara rushed forward and caught him as he dropped the chickens and nearly fell. "Are you insane?" she cried, trying to guide him toward the well. "Couldn't let them burn." He rasped. She splashed water on his face, washing away soot and blood. "You could have died." "I said I'd stay," he whispered hoarsely. "You saved me." "I stay." And for the first time since she had brought him home, she heard it, not just resolve, but belonging. Hawk's wounds weren't deep, but Clara made him sit anyway. He looked ridiculous, slouched on a stool in her kitchen with his legs too long and his frame too wide for the space. But he didn't argue as she cleaned the cut on his arm, gently dabbing away the soot and blood. "You don't flinch," she muttered, dipping the cloth in a bowl of water. "That's unnatural. I've had worse. I don't doubt it." The silence stretched between them, not uncomfortable, but full of things neither of them had said yet. When she finished wrapping the bandage, she didn't move away. Her hand lingered just a moment longer than necessary on his forearm. "I know what they say about you," she said finally, "in town, and I know most of it isn't true." Hawk didn't look at her. "They say enough to hang me. That's all they need. I want to hear it from you." He was quiet for so long she thought he wouldn't answer. Then, without lifting his head, he said, "I was a scout for the U.S. Cavalry. My father was Comanche. My mother taken from a German wagon train when she was young. They raised me together until a sickness took them both." He swallowed hard, jaw tense. "I grew up with 2 tongues, 2 customs, never truly belonging to either." Clara sat down opposite him, listening. "When I was 15, I was taken by a detachment from Fort Wallace. They trained me, used me. I could ride, track, speak English. They said I was a bridge between worlds." He gave a bitter half-smile. "Bridges get stepped on. What happened?" she asked gently. "There was a treaty talk between the Army and a Southern Comanche band. I tried to broker it. I thought I could prevent more blood. But the Army wanted land, not peace. They raided the village the night after the talk, killed women, children, burned everything." He paused, staring at the floor. "I warned them, and they ignored me. I tried to stop it. Took a bullet in the leg for my trouble. When I woke, they had me shackled, called me a traitor, said I was conspiring with hostiles. Never mind the years I served, never mind the scars." Clara sat frozen. "I escaped during transport, hid in the canyons. Then some bounty man from Granger's Crossing found me half dead, sold me to the sheriff like I was livestock." She realized then he had no tribe, no country, no name anyone respected. Only what she'd given him, Hawk, and the brand on his arm, a B for bounty burned into his skin like shame. Not by his people, not by his enemies, but by those he had once served. "I'm sorry," she said quietly. He looked up at her, truly looked, as if trying to see whether her sorrow was real. "Why did you buy me?" he asked, voice low and bare. "What did you see in a man with a sack on his head?" Clara didn't flinch. "I saw someone no one wanted," she said. "And I've known what that feels like." He tilted his head slightly. When my husband died, the town stopped calling. Friends dried up. Everyone said I needed to sell the land, remarry, start fresh. I didn't want to be saved. I just wanted someone to stand with me. She met his eyes. You stood with me in the fire. You didn't run. I said I'd stay, he replied. You did more than stay. She smiled faintly, and for the first time he didn't look away. That night, the wind blew hard from the west, stirring the dying ashes of the barn. Hawk stood outside, his silhouette tall against the embers. Clara joined him, wrapping her shawl tighter as she approached. We'll rebuild, she said, looking at the ruined beams. It'll take time. I can build it stronger. I know you can. He hesitated. The land north of here belongs to no one yet. But if the army comes again, they'll try to take it. You think that smoke was scouting parties? I think there are men who don't want you or me out here. She was quiet for a moment. Then, let them come. We'll stand. He looked at her again, that slow, measured way of his. You speak like a Comanche woman, she smiled. You don't know what kind of woman I am. He didn't smile, but something shifted in his eyes. A glimmer of something unspoken, not gratitude, not even trust. Something deeper, and as the wind carried smoke and memory into the dark, they stood side by side, two unwanted souls, finally choosing each other. 3 days after the fire, the barn was nothing but a pile of blackened timbers. But the fields had never looked more alive. Hawk had built a temporary shelter for the mule out of salvaged planks, and the hens wandered freely between it and the coop he'd half rebuilt. Clara was repairing the garden rows when she noticed something strange. She wasn't tired. The weight she'd carried for years, the grief, the isolation, the fear of being alone in a world that didn't care if she survived, felt just a little lighter now. And she knew exactly why. That evening, she cooked rabbit stew and cornbread, and when Hawk came in, he washed his hands before he touched the table. Without a word, he sat down and ate beside her, as if they'd done it 100 times before. You're quieter than usual, she said. He nodded. Thinking? Listening. To what? He looked out the window. Something coming. Clara tilted her head. You mean people? He didn't answer. Just kept chewing. That was Hawk's way, never guessing, never panicking. But when he said something was coming, she believed him. The next day, Clara rode into town for supplies, nails, oil, a sack of salt. Hawk didn't want her going alone. But she reminded him she wasn't some porcelain doll. Still, she felt every eye on her. As she walked into the mercantile, Mrs. Yates stiffened behind the counter. Mr. Henley pretended not to see her. Even the boy sweeping the steps outside stopped and stared as Clara set her things on the counter. She heard a door swing open hard. Samuel Riggs. His face was still mottled with bruises from when Hawk had thrown him like a sack of feed. And his ego looked no less wounded. Well, look what the wind blew in, he drawled. Clara turned slowly. I'm just here for salt and nails, Samuel, not conversation. He stepped closer. You should have thought about that before you brought a red-skinned brute into our town. She met his gaze evenly. He's not in your town. He's on my land, and he's done more to protect it than any of you ever did. Samuel's eyes narrowed. That beast is going to bring trouble to your door, Clara. Mark me. I already have trouble, she said coolly. And he's standing right in front of me. He grabbed her wrist. It was fast and rough, meant to scare her, not hurt her, but the message was clear. She wasn't welcome here anymore. And then came another voice. Deep, calm, icy. Let go. Every head in the mercantile turned. Hawk. He stood in the doorway, still as a statue, wind curling around him like something alive. Samuel dropped her wrist and backed up one step. Then another. This ain't your business, he said quickly. It is, Hawk said. She is mine. A gasp came. From someone near the flour barrels. Clara stepped in fast. That's enough, both of you. But her voice was barely needed, because Hawk's glare alone had already emptied the air between them. Without another word, Samuel turned and stormed out. Back at the homestead, Clara paced the kitchen. You didn't need to follow me, she said. You could have been arrested. I didn't follow you, Hawk interrupted. I watched from the ridge. I saw him go inside. Clara stopped pacing. You watched the whole time? He nodded. Something inside her twisted. It wasn't fear. It was safety. You said something back there, she murmured. She is mine. He didn't blink. You are, her heart fluttered. You don't own me. I know. Then why say it? Because it's true. He stepped closer. Not like a thing to be kept. Like a fire I protect. Like ground I stand on. Like something I die for. Clara couldn't speak. No man, not even Isaac, had ever said something that steady. That raw. She reached out and touched the side of Hawk's face. He leaned into it. I'm not good at meeting people, she whispered. I don't ask for what you're not ready to give. They stood that way for a long moment together, but not touching beyond her fingertips on his jaw. And in that stillness, with the threat of town men, fire, and judgment still hanging around them, something deeper grew between them. Not just survival. Not just loyalty, but love. Blooming slow and wild like desert flowers after a storm. It came just after midnight. The wind had shifted, carrying with it the scent of burning oil and something worse, intent. Hawk smelled it before Clara even stirred. He was already at the window when the first torch hit the edge of the woodshed. A soft thump. Then flames licking up the dry boards. He moved fast, silent as a shadow. In the house, Clara woke to the smell of smoke and the creak of the floorboards. She was reaching for her rifle when the front door swung open. It started, Hawk said simply. No panic, just fact. She threw on her boots. How many? He glanced over his shoulder. 4, maybe 5, coming from the east. Riggs is with them. Clara's pulse thudded in her ears. They're going to try to burn us out. They're not here for fire, Hawk said, loading a knife into his belt. They're here for you. They split quickly. Hawk moved to the back, disappearing into the shadows like a wolf. While Clara kept low inside with the rifle trained on the door, the flames grew outside, sending golden light flickering against the walls. Then came a voice. Clara. A man shouted. Come out and we'll leave the house alone. Samuel Riggs. Keep hiding your monster and we'll tear this place to the ground. Another torch was thrown, this time hitting the edge of the porch. The dry boards caught instantly. Clara cursed, grabbed the water bucket and doused it, but 2 more torches came flying in. They weren't playing bluff anymore. Then a scream cut through the darkness. Clara spun toward it and heard the unmistakable crack of bone. One man down. Then another groan, something heavy hitting dirt. She held her breath. Silence again. Then footsteps on her porch. She raised her rifle. Steady. The door creaked. A shape appeared. Hawk. She whispered urgently. It was not Hawk. Samuel Riggs kicked the door open, pistol in hand, eyes wild with firelight and hate. But Clara didn't freeze. She fired. The shot grazed his shoulder enough to spin him back into the doorframe with a scream. You crazy witch. He spat, raising his pistol, and then Hawk was there. He hit Riggs so hard the man's boots left the ground. The gun clattered across the floor. Hawk grabbed the man by the collar and dragged him outside like a bag of grain. Clara followed, rifle still raised, hands shaking. Outside, 2 more attackers lay groaning in the dirt, one unconscious, one crawling away with a broken arm. Hawk stood over Samuel, breathing hard but calm. His fists were bloodied, his face unreadable. Clara caught up to him. You didn't kill them. No, he said. Why not? Because you're watching, Hawk said quietly, and you still see the man, not the monster. She swallowed. Hard. And what do you see? He looked at her, then really looked. I see the only reason I didn't become what they say I am. The next morning, the sheriff came riding up, flanked by 2 deputies. The attackers were already tied up, bruised, and miserable. Clara sat on the porch, rifle beside her, dress still covered in soot. The sheriff dismounted slowly, jaw tight. Riggs' father's not going to like this, he muttered. Glancing at the unconscious form of his son, Clara crossed her arms. They came onto my land, set my barn on fire, came at me with guns. Your job's not to make rich men feel better. Your job is to enforce the law. The sheriff stared at her for a long time. Then he turned to Hawk, who stood silently nearby, arms crossed. You should have run, he said. I did, Hawk replied. And it nearly killed me, the sheriff sighed. People like Riggs are going to keep coming, Clara stood. Then, they better learn we shoot back. After a long pause, the sheriff nodded to his men. Take them to lockup. Clara watched them go, heart-pounding, not because of fear, but because of what she had just chosen. This land, this life, this man, and... She knew something now, deep in her soul. They were no longer running. They were defending. Together. 3 days passed after the attack. The town buzzed with gossip, but no one dared come near Clara McBride's land again. The scorched earth, the collapsed barn, and the broken men hauled off by the sheriff were enough warning. Inside her little house, things had changed. Clara no longer kept a rifle beside the bed. She no longer double-checked the locks before sleep. And when she woke, Hawk was already at work chopping wood, feeding the mule, repairing what had been damaged by fire, and... foolishness. He hadn't said much. He never did. But she could feel it. Something had settled in him. A choice made. This wasn't just where he was hiding. This was home. That morning, Clara stepped out with 2 mugs of coffee and found Hawk at the edge of the garden. He'd just finished driving in new fence posts. You're going to wear yourself. Down, she said with a soft smile. He took the mug with a nod. Rest doesn't come easy to men like me. She sipped her coffee, then looked at him. Really looked. His hair had grown longer. The bruises had faded, and the fire that once burned behind his eyes had cooled into something steadier, fierce, but anchored. I was thinking, she began, hesitant, about the land beyond the creek. The army never laid claim to it. It's still wild. Good grazing. If it were cleared. He studied her. You want to expand? I want to build. We need to build. She didn't miss the way his eyes flicked to her when she said we. Clara turned her gaze to the hills. When Isaac died, I thought. That was it for me. I thought God gave me 1 season to bloom, and the rest would just be survival. She glanced back at Hawk. But now I don't feel like surviving anymore. I feel like living. He said nothing. But he reached out and took her hand in his. A simple gesture, but coming from a man who had spent years locked in silence, chained, branded, hunted. It was everything. That night, Clara lit a small fire behind the house. The air smelled of pine and early summer. Hawk sat beside her, legs stretched long, head tilted toward the stars. I should have died in that transport, he said suddenly. They beat me before I escaped. Left me bleeding. I crawled 5 miles before someone found me. Clara looked over. And yet you lived. I didn't want to. Not then, she swallowed. What changed? He was quiet for a long time. Then a woman in the square raised her hand. Tears stung the corners of her eyes. I didn't. Know what I was doing? Yes, you did, he said softly. You were the first person who didn't look through me. Or over me. You saw me, even with the sack over my head. She looked down. And what do you see when you look at me? He turned to face her fully now. I see a woman braver than any soldier I rode with. I see someone who's lost, bled, and built again with her own hands. I see a storm wrapped in skin." She let out a shaky breath. "Hawk." He stood then, walked a few feet away, and knelt down. When he came back, he held something out in his palm, a ring, wooden, hand-carved, smooth as river stone, with a single black feather etched into its face. "I have no preacher, no land papers, but I have this." Her breath caught in her throat. "I was never given a name by the army, just numbers. But if you want me beside you, not as a worker, not as a body to protect your land, but as a man, then I give you all that I am." Clara reached out and took the ring with trembling fingers. "Never wanted another husband," she whispered. "But I want you." He slid the ring on her finger-rough hands, shaking just slightly. Then he leaned forward and kissed her gentle. Slow, reverent. The fire crackled beside them. Above. The stars stretched over the prairie like a silent blessing. And at last, the two who were never meant to survive chose to live together. The wedding wasn't in a church. There was no preacher, no white dress, no piano. Just the wind, the land, and the creek that finally began to trickle again after years of silence. They stood beneath the twisted mesquite tree near the ridge, Clara in her worn blue skirt, Hawk in the cleanest shirt he owned. Sheriff Merton served as witness, awkward but sincere, holding a folded Bible and looking anywhere but directly at the couple. Clara said no vows. She didn't need to. Instead, she simply placed her hand in Hawk's and said, "I stand with you." And he said, "I stand with you." That was enough. The ring he gave her, a carved band of cedar, soft with oil, had been shaped from a branch he found near the ashes of the barn. Something dead, reborn. They kissed only once, but it was a kiss that settled the dust between their bones. After the wedding, people in town stopped staring quite so long. No one welcomed her. Not outright, but they kept their distance. Even Samuel Riggs, left with a crooked shoulder and a broken nose, never came near her land again. Clara didn't care. She had Hawk. She had peace. And for the first time, she had a future. The rebuilt barn stood strong, framed by new wood and Hawk's hands. The garden grew. The mule carried its load without complaint. And Clara's land-long neglected breathed again. Neighbors still whispered, said the Comanche was cursed, that a woman living with a man like him was surely doomed. But it was Clara who stood tall in the general store now, head high, eyes unafraid, because she had chosen him not as an act of charity, but as an act of faith. One late summer night, Clara sat on the porch, her hand resting on her belly. She hadn't told him yet. She didn't know how. She was nearly 40, and life hadn't been kind to her body. But still it had happened. Life, despite everything, had taken root again. Hawk came up the steps, dust on his boots, shirt open at the throat. He paused when he saw her face. "You're quiet," she smiled faintly. "So are you." He knelt beside her and took her hand. "You're shaking." She nodded. "I have something to tell you." He said nothing, only watched her with that deep, still gaze. "I'm with child." She whispered for a long moment. He didn't move. Then he leaned forward and pressed his forehead gently to her belly. He didn't speak. He didn't need to. She felt the tears drip down his cheek. Silent, warm. Not fear, not regret, but hope. They never left that land. The army never came again. Years later, long after the town changed names and the creek dried once more, people still spoke of the woman who raised her hand at the auction and claimed the man with a sack on his head. Some said she was mad. Some said she was a witch. But those who rode past her, homestead, who saw the fields, the laughter of children, the Comanche man working shoulder to shoulder with a woman who looked at him like he hung the stars, knew better. Clara McBride wasn't mad. She was brave. And Hawk? He wasn't a monster. He was the kind of man only love could bring back to life.